Many stories of faith are about comfort, healing, or miracles. But there is one account in the ancient world that stands apart. A story so dark and so demanding that it challenges everything we think we know about the divine. It's a moment where God gives a man a terrifying command that seems designed to break him, a command that seemed to contradict every promise God had ever made. Why would a benevolent creator demand such a horrific act? And what did this man see in the middle of his darkest hour that gave him the resolve to face God's instructions? To answer these questions, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a miracle that started in a desert tent, where a 100-year-old man was about to experience the surprise of a lifetime. Abraham was 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90 when the impossible finally happened. For decades, they had lived with the social shame of being childless, watching their biological window close until it seemed their family line would simply vanish into the desert. God had promised Abraham a great nation, yet for a century there was no heir to lead it. Then Isaac was born, a physical miracle that defied every law of nature and age. His name literally means "he laughs," a direct reference to the disbelief Sarah felt when she first heard she would conceive. The birth of this boy wasn't just a personal joy. It was the physical proof that God's word was absolute. It secured the family's future in a land they didn't yet own, and gave Abraham a reason to believe the promises of the past. But this era of laughter was about to be met with a demand that would force Abraham to choose between his son and his God. Isaac was known as the son of the promise because he was the legal and spiritual pillar of everything Abraham built. In the ancient world, a man's bloodline was his only form of survival and his only way to impact the future. Without Isaac, Abraham's name would die with him, and the contract he made with God would effectively be cancelled. Isaac represented the physical bridge between a nomadic shepherd and the father of a vast people. Sarah saw the boy as her ultimate vindication, the child who erased years of silence and mockery. To Abraham, Isaac was the living evidence that he had not followed a false voice into the wilderness. Every time he looked at his son, he saw the fulfillment of a long-term plan that stretched across generations. Then God spoke again, and this time the message was a direct order to destroy the very future he had just created. God called out to Abraham and gave him a specific, harrowing instruction that targeted the center of his world. He told Abraham to take his only son, the one he loved, and travel to the land of Moriah. Once there, Abraham was ordered to offer Isaac as a burnt offering on a mountain that God would later point out. A burnt offering was not a minor ritual. It required the total destruction of the victim by fire on an altar. God specified Isaac by name to ensure there was no confusion or substitute allowed for this specific task. The command was a direct test designed to see if Abraham valued the Creator more than the gift the Creator had given him. The destination was a 3-day journey away, a distance that forced Abraham to live with the weight of the order for 72 hours. If Abraham followed through, he would personally end the very bloodline that God had sworn to protect and multiply. This wasn't just a test of faith. It was an order to commit an act that contradicted every previous word God had spoken. The conflict here was a total clash between God's past promises and his current command. Years earlier, God had explicitly stated that through Isaac, Abraham's descendants would be named and counted. Now, God was telling him to kill that same son before the boy had grown old enough to have children of his own. If Isaac died on that mountain, the promise of a great nation became a physical impossibility. Abraham was caught between the logic of the original contract and the authority of the one who wrote it. There were no other heirs waiting in the wings, no backup plans, and no second chances for a man of Abraham's advanced age. To kill Isaac was to voluntarily kill the future of the entire people Abraham had been chosen to lead. Yet the biblical record shows no sign of Abraham arguing, pleading for mercy, or asking for a different path. Instead of fighting the command, Abraham made a decision that would change the course of human history. Abraham resolved to obey the command in total silence, keeping the true purpose of the trip hidden from everyone around him. He did not tell Sarah because she would have likely viewed the command as madness and used every means possible to stop him. He kept the secret from his servants to ensure they would not try to rescue the boy or interfere with the sacrifice. He took the burden entirely onto his own shoulders, choosing to trust that the same God who performed a miracle at Isaac's birth could perform another at his death. This silence was a protective measure, ensuring that no human emotion or outside pressure could break his resolve. He moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency, preparing the wood and the fire as if he were performing a standard chore. Abraham's focus turned inward, treating the journey as a series of necessary steps toward an unthinkable end. But the hardest part of the secret wasn't the silence. It was having to walk beside Isaac for 3 days, knowing exactly how the trip was supposed to end. Abraham woke up early in the morning, well before the sun rose over the desert horizon. He didn't wait for his servants to wake him or for Sarah to ask about his plans for the day, because he needed to leave before the camp became active. In the ancient Near East, family life was communal, making a secret departure nearly impossible once the household was awake. By moving in the dark, Abraham ensured that his resolve wouldn't be softened by the sight of his wife or the routine of his home. He moved with the focused intent of a man who had already processed his grief and replaced it with a grim sense of duty. Every movement was designed to prevent any delay in fulfilling the command he had received from God. He was over 100 years old, yet he performed these tasks with a physical urgency that ignored his age. This was the first morning of a journey that felt like the end of his legacy. But as he stepped out into the cold air, he knew there was no turning back from the path God had set. The first physical task of the day was splitting the wood for the burnt offering. Abraham didn't delegate this to a servant. He took the axe himself to ensure the wood was prepared exactly as required for a ritual fire. In the sacrificial system of the time, a burnt offering needed enough wood to maintain a high temperature until the entire sacrifice was consumed. Each strike of the axe served as a rhythmic reminder of the specific purpose this wood would serve on the mountain. He wasn't just preparing fuel for a campfire. He was preparing the material that would turn his son into smoke and ash. The manual labor provided a distraction from the mental horror of the command. Yet it also made the reality of the coming event impossible to ignore. He piled the wood carefully, selecting dry pieces that would burn long and hot. This preparation was the legal necessity to ensure the sacrifice met the requirements God had established for such offerings. To an observer, he looked like a diligent provider, but in reality, he was building the instruments of his own son's execution. What Isaac didn't realize as he watched was that the wood his father was stacking was meant for him. Once the wood was ready, Abraham personally saddled his donkey and chose 2 of his young servants to accompany him. The donkey was the primary pack animal for such a journey, capable of carrying the heavy wood, the food, and the supplies needed for multiple days in the wilderness. The servants were included for protection against bandits and to manage the logistics of the camp during the long trek. Abraham chose them specifically for their reliability, though he had no intention of letting them witness the final act on the mountain. Their presence provided a layer of normalcy to the expedition, making it look like a standard religious pilgrimage or a business trip. Isaac was called to join them, likely excited for a journey with his father into the hills. Abraham watched his son interact with the servants, knowing this was likely the last time the boy would ever see them. He checked the straps on the pack animal with a precision that bordered on obsession, making sure everything was secure for the 3-day trek. Everything was in place, but Abraham was leading his party toward a destination that only he understood. The group left the settlement of Beersheba and began the trek toward the northern hill country. Beersheba was the southernmost point of the settled land, a place of wells and security that Abraham had worked hard to establish. By walking away from this home, he was physically leaving behind the safety of his established life and the protection of his clan. The path toward Moriah led through rugged, unforgiving terrain that tested the endurance of the elderly man and the young boy alike. They traveled at a steady pace, moving deeper into the wilderness where the rules of civilization no longer applied. Abraham kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for the landmarks that would guide them to the specific mountain God had mentioned. The geography of the region was a constant reminder of the isolation required for such a profound test of faith. Every mile covered was a mile further away from the life Abraham had built over the last century. Behind him lay 100 years of history, but ahead of him lay a mountain that threatened to erase it all. Throughout the first day of travel, Abraham maintained a crushing emotional isolation that separated him from his son and his servants. He walked in a silence that was misinterpreted by the others as the typical gravity of a patriarch focused on a religious mission. In reality, he was holding a secret that would have caused any other man to break under the pressure. He had to act as a father, a leader, and a master, while simultaneously preparing to be a priest and an executioner. The physical closeness of Isaac, hearing his voice, seeing him walk, was a constant source of internal agony for Abraham. Every question Isaac asked about the journey was a dagger to Abraham's heart, yet he answered with enough clarity to avoid suspicion. He carried the theological weight of God's covenant and the personal weight of a father's love, and the two were currently at war. This was not a test of strength, but a test of which love was ultimate in Abraham's soul. By the time the sun set on that first day, the path back to Sarah and safety had already begun to disappear. The journey to Moriah lasted 3 full days, a time frame that served as a psychological crucible for Abraham. In the ancient world, a 3-day trek was the standard length for a serious journey, but here it provided 72 hours of opportunity for Abraham to change his mind. Every step north was a conscious choice to continue toward an act that defied human logic and parental instinct. He didn't have the luxury of a sudden, impulsive decision. He had to recommit to the sacrifice with every sunrise and every camp set at night. The terrain was rocky and elevated, forcing the 100-year-old man to exert himself physically while his mind wrestled with the impending death of his heir. This window of time stripped away any blind religious fervor, leaving only a cold, calculated obedience. If he were going to turn back, he had hundreds of chances to do so. Yet the further they traveled from the safety of Beersheba, the more certain the destination became. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place God had designated from a distance. Mount Moriah rose out of the landscape, a specific peak that would later become the site of the Jewish temple and the heart of Jerusalem. Seeing the mountain transformed the abstract command into a physical reality that could no longer be ignored. For 2 days, the sacrifice was a concept. Now it was a geographical coordinate. The sight didn't bring relief, but a sharpening of the internal tension that had been building since they left home. Abraham recognized the landmark immediately, likely through a divine prompting or a specific sign he had been told to look for. The distance between the group and the summit was now small enough to be covered in a few hours of climbing. But as the mountain came into focus, the reality of what Abraham had to do finally stood tall before him. Abraham stopped the group at the base of the mountain and gave a direct order to his 2 servants. He told them to stay behind with the donkey and wait while he and Isaac went further up the mountain to worship. This was a strategic move to ensure the sacrifice could proceed without any interference from men who would have felt a moral duty to save the boy. If the servants had seen Abraham raise a knife against his own son, they would have been obligated by common law and human decency to stop him. By isolating himself and Isaac, Abraham removed the possibility of a rescue that would have invalidated the test of his obedience. He was clearing the stage for a private transaction between a man and his God, where no witnesses could sway the outcome. The servants obeyed without question, assuming this was a routine ritual on a high place. They sat down to wait, unaware that they were watching a father walk his son to an execution ground. Before leaving the servants, Abraham said something that has puzzled historians and theologians for centuries. He told them, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you." On the surface, this looked like a lie intended to keep Isaac and the servants calm while they moved toward the altar. However, in the context of Abraham's life, it was a profound statement of absolute faith in God's power to reverse death. He knew he was going to kill Isaac, but he also knew God had promised a nation through Isaac, meaning the boy had to return alive. Abraham was operating under the assumption that if he killed his son, God would simply raise him from the dead right there on the mountain. This wasn't a comfort to him, but a logical necessity based on the character of the God he served. He was walking toward a murder, yet he fully expected a resurrection. As they began the final ascent, Abraham took the heavy wood for the burnt offering and placed it on Isaac's shoulders. He himself carried only the vessel of fire and the sacrificial knife, leaving the physical weight of the instrument of death to the victim. Isaac was a young man at this point, likely in his teens or early 20s, and possessed the physical strength that his elderly father lacked. There is a haunting symbolism in the son carrying the very wood that would soon be used to consume him. They walked up the slope together, the silence between them growing heavier as the summit drew closer. Isaac didn't complain about the weight, trusting his father's direction as they climbed higher into the thin air. The transition of the wood from the donkey to the son marked the final phase of the preparation. Every step Isaac took up that hill was bringing him closer to the moment he would be laid on top of that same wood. The father and son climbed the final slope of Moriah, alone, a scene of profound isolation from the rest of the world. Abraham held the torch containing the fire, likely a vessel of burning coals, and the sharp bronze knife used for slaughtering livestock. Isaac carried the heavy bundle of wood, the physical burden of the ascent pressing into his shoulders. For 3 days they had traveled with the servants, but this final stretch was reserved for the two central figures of the covenant. The path was steep and rocky, forcing a slow, deliberate pace that allowed every second of the coming reality to sink in. Abraham's silence was no longer just a secret. It was the heavy atmosphere of a man approaching a cliff. Isaac, observant and trained in the family's religious customs, began to realize that something fundamental was missing from their ritual. But as he looked at his father's face, he saw a resolve that discouraged any casual conversation. As they walked, Isaac finally voiced the question that had been building since they left the servants at the base of the hill. He addressed his father with respect, pointing out that they had the fire and they had the wood, but there was no lamb for the burnt offering. In their culture, a sacrifice without a victim was a logical and spiritual impossibility. Isaac was not a child. He understood the mechanics of worship and knew that a burnt offering required a life to be given. His question was practical, yet it pierced through Abraham's emotional defenses with surgical precision. It forced Abraham to address the gap between their supplies and the command he had received. At this moment, the boy was essentially asking his father why they were walking toward an altar with nothing to put on it. Isaac didn't know that he was the missing piece of the puzzle. Abraham responded with a phrase that was both a shield for his son and a prophetic declaration of his own hope. He told Isaac, "God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." This wasn't just a clever way to avoid the truth. It was a statement of Abraham's core theology. He believed that if God demanded a life, God was also the only one capable of replacing that life or restoring it. By saying, "God will provide," Abraham was deferring the ultimate outcome to the divine, refusing to take the role of the final judge. They continued the climb together, unified by this cryptic promise, though only one of them understood the literal stakes. This answer allowed them to reach the summit without a confrontation that would have turned the sacrifice into a struggle. Abraham had spoken a truth he didn't yet see, betting everything on a miracle that hadn't happened yet. They reached the specific spot on the summit that God had designated, a place of flat rock and sweeping views of the surrounding hills. There was no fanfare, no supernatural light, and no further instructions from the sky. There was only the physical work that needed to be done. Abraham began the manual labor of gathering large field stones to build the altar. In the ancient world, an altar was a functional structure, built high enough to keep the fire off the ground and sturdy enough to hold the weight of a body. Each stone Abraham lifted and placed was a physical act of obedience, a slow construction of his own grief. He worked with the expertise of a man who had built many altars before, but this one carried a weight that none of the others had. Isaac assisted him, moving the stones into place and following his father's lead as they shaped the platform for the fire. The altar was finished, standing as a silent monument to the end of a 100-year journey. Once the stones were set, Abraham meticulously arranged the wood on top of the altar. This was the laying of the wood, a ritualistic step designed to ensure the fire would burn evenly and consume the offering entirely. He didn't rush the process. He handled the wood Isaac had carried up the mountain with a grim, practiced care. Every piece of timber was placed to create the necessary airflow for a hot, sustained flame. At this point, the preparations were complete, and the vacuum of the missing lamb became an unbearable tension. The mountain summit was silent, removed from the noise of the camp and the eyes of the world. There were no more tasks to perform, no more miles to walk, and no more questions to answer. All that remained was the final, devastating transition from preparation to execution. The physical work of gathering stones was finished, and the altar stood as a stark, waist-high platform on the mountain's peak. Abraham now turned to the wood Isaac had carried up the slope, meticulously arranging the dry timber in a specific pattern to ensure it would catch fire quickly and burn with maximum intensity. This was the final mechanical act of the ritual, a process Abraham had performed dozens of times in his life, but never with this level of internal weight. Every piece of wood placed was a step closer to the moment of no return. Isaac stood by, watching his father's practiced hands, likely realizing that the lamb his father spoke of still hadn't appeared. The silence on the summit was absolute, broken only by the sound of wood scraping against stone. The stage was set, and the physical environment was now fully prepared for a death. The moment of revelation finally arrived when Abraham had to look his son in the eye and explain that there was no animal coming. History does not record the exact words spoken, but the physical reality of the situation became the primary communicator. Abraham had to reveal that the lamb God would provide was, in fact, Isaac himself. This was the most vulnerable point of the entire narrative, where the relationship between father and son was tested against their mutual relationship with God. Abraham wasn't just a priest at this moment. He was a father delivering a death sentence to his own miracle. He had to explain that the command came from the same God who had given Isaac life in the first place. The secret that Abraham had carried for 3 days was finally out, and the choice now rested as much with the son as it did with the father. What followed is known in Hebrew tradition as the Akedah, or the binding. Abraham took cords and began to tie Isaac's hands and feet, a standard procedure for a sacrificial victim to prevent them from struggling or falling off the altar once the fire began. This was a slow, intimate process of restraint, requiring Abraham to touch the very limbs he had watched grow and strengthen over the years. Each knot tied was a physical acknowledgement that the boy was no longer a person in this context, but an offering. The act of binding a human being is an assertion of total control and a preparation for total loss. Abraham's hands, though old, had to be steady enough to secure the boy who represented his entire future. As the ropes tightened, the physical connection between the two was replaced by the cold logic of the sacrifice. A critical but often overlooked detail of this story is Isaac's voluntary submission to the binding. At this point, Abraham was well over 100 years old, while Isaac was a young man in the prime of his physical strength. If Isaac had chosen to resist, he could have easily overpowered his father, fled down the mountain, or fought for his life. Instead, the biblical text suggests a terrifyingly calm cooperation. Isaac allowed himself to be bound and led to the altar. He chose to trust his father's faith and God's hidden plan, even as he was being prepared for slaughter. This wasn't a case of a child being tricked, but of a man choosing to become a martyr for a covenant he had inherited. The strength of the son was channeled into the same obedience that drove the father. The final physical act of preparation was the lifting of Isaac onto the altar. Abraham had to summon his remaining physical strength to hoist the bound body of his son and place him on top of the arranged wood. Isaac now lay horizontally, staring up at the sky, his body positioned exactly where the fire would soon be lit. This was the point of maximum tension, where the promise of a great nation was physically pinned to a pile of kindling. The transition from son to sacrifice was complete. Isaac was no longer standing beside his father, but was now the focal point of the ritual. Abraham stood over him, the fire and the knife within reach, and the 3-day journey narrowed down to a single, final movement. Everything was ready, and for the first time in a century, the lineage of Abraham was only seconds away from extinction. Abraham reached out his hand and drew the knife from its sheath, a movement that marked the end of the long ascent and the beginning of the final ritual. The blade was likely a heavy tool made of sharpened bronze or flint, designed for the practical, messy work of animal slaughter. It was cold and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the heat of the fire vessel he had carried up the mountain. There was no more room for metaphor or the hope of a misunderstanding. The ritual had reached its physical conclusion. Abraham's fingers closed around the handle with a grip hardened by a century of life and now strained by the weight of this final act. He looked down at his son, the child of 100-year wait, who was now reduced to a sacrificial victim. The blade was held with a professional steadying, intended to be quick and final as the religious law of the time demanded. But at this exact moment, the history of the entire covenant hung on the edge of a single downward stroke. Abraham raised the knife high into the air, his arm fully extended for the strike. This was the peak of the trial, the moment where internal intent became indistinguishable from the physical act itself. In the eyes of the divine, the sacrifice was already complete because Abraham had fully committed his will to the execution of the command. Isaac lay still on the wood, his eyes likely fixed on the blade or the sky above, a silent witness to his father's absolute loyalty. If the blade fell, the covenant was physically broken, the bloodline was severed, and the promise of a great nation was buried on this summit. There was no hesitation in Abraham's posture, and no sign of a man waiting for a last-minute rescue or a change of heart. He was prepared to walk back down that mountain alone, leaving his heart and his future behind him. Then, just as the muscles in his arm tensed to deliver the blow, a sound tore through the silence of the mountain peak. A voice erupted from the heavens, calling Abraham's name twice in rapid succession. "Abraham! Abraham!" It was the angel of the Lord, intervening at the precise microsecond before the knife could make contact with the boy's skin. The repetition of the name signaled an extreme urgency, a divine command to halt the process immediately before the blood was shed. Abraham stopped mid-motion, the knife still suspended over his son's chest, and responded with the same words he had used at the start of the journey. "Here I am." The physical tension of the scene shifted from the terror of execution to the shock of an unexpected stay of death. The command to kill was now replaced by a command to stop, marking the end of the 3-day psychological trial. This wasn't a suggestion or a request, it was a sovereign veto of the very sacrifice God had previously ordered. The knife remained in Abraham's hand, but its purpose had been shattered by a single sentence. The angel of the Lord delivered a message that redefined the purpose of the entire ordeal and revealed the true nature of the test. The voice commanded Abraham not to lay a hand on the boy or do anything to harm him, effectively ending Isaac's role as the victim. God declared that he now knew that Abraham feared him because he had not withheld his only son, the one he loved, from the divine. This knowing wasn't about God gaining new information, but about Abraham's faith being made visible and undeniable through physical action. The test had proven that Abraham's devotion to the giver of the promise was greater than his devotion to the promise itself. By being willing to lose everything, Abraham had actually secured the legal and spiritual right to keep it. The fear of God was demonstrated not through a feeling of terror, but through a total, life-altering obedience that ignored personal cost. Abraham had passed the ultimate test, but he was still standing over a bound son on a pile of wood. The immediate physical and emotional relief that followed the voice was overwhelming, though it was likely met with a profound sense of shock. Abraham's arm finally dropped, and the knife, which had been the most important object in the world a moment ago, became a discarded tool. The crushing weight of the secret he had carried for 3 days began to evaporate, replaced by the realization that Isaac would live to see the next hour. The father reached down, not to strike, but to begin the process of unbinding his son's hands and feet, freeing him from the altar. The atmosphere of the summit changed from a place of death to a place of deliverance in a matter of seconds. Every breath Isaac took was now a gift, a second life granted by the same authority that had asked for his death. They were still on a mountain of sacrifice, but the nature of the blood to be shed was about to change. As Isaac stood up from the altar, Abraham's eyes were suddenly drawn to a movement in the nearby brush. Abraham looked up from the altar and saw a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. This was the immediate, physical answer to the prophecy he had spoken to Isaac during their ascent, that God would provide the sacrifice. The ram was a mature male sheep, a fitting substitute under the sacrificial laws that Abraham lived by. Its entrapment in the brush was no accident of nature. It was a divine placement designed to resolve the crisis on the summit without the loss of human life. This animal represented the first instance of substitutionary sacrifice in the biblical narrative, where one life is given to ransom another. Abraham moved quickly to secure the animal, ensuring that the ritual he started could be completed legally and spiritually. The presence of the ram meant that the altar would not go cold, even though Isaac was now standing safely by his father's side. The substitution was a literal fulfillment of the faith Abraham had expressed only hours earlier. When he had told Isaac that God will provide himself a lamb, he was operating on a belief in God's character rather than a visible reality. Now, the ram was the tangible proof that his faith was not a delusion but a grounded trust in a provider. Abraham took the animal, killed it, and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. The blood that stained the stones of the altar was that of the ram, not the heir of the covenant. Isaac watched the entire process, seeing the animal consume the fire that was originally meant for him. This moment established a precedent that would define the religious identity of Abraham's descendants for millennia. The son had been returned to the father, and the divine demand for a life had been satisfied by a substitute. To commemorate this event, Abraham named the location Jehovah-Jireh, which translates to "the Lord will provide." This wasn't just a label for a mountain. It was a theological anchor for the entire nation that would follow him. The name served as a permanent reminder that when God brings his people to the point of total loss, he is also the one who provides the way out. This mountain, Moriah, would not remain an isolated wilderness peak. Hundreds of years later, it would become the site where King Solomon would build the first temple, the permanent dwelling place of God's presence among the Israelites. The very rock where Isaac was bound would eventually become the foundation stone of the most sacred building in the Jewish world. The name Abraham gave the mountain transformed a site of personal trauma into a landmark of national hope. The connection between this site and the future of Jerusalem is one of the most significant geographic links in the Bible. By choosing Moriah for this test, God was pre-authorizing the location for the entire sacrificial system that would be established under Moses. The act of substitution that took place with the ram foreshadowed the daily sacrifices that would eventually occur in the temple. It signaled that this specific mountain was the designated meeting point between human obedience and divine mercy. Every priest who would later offer a lamb on that mountain was standing in the footsteps of Abraham. The geography of the event ensured that the story of Isaac's deliverance was woven into the literal soil of the capital city. What happened in the isolation of the wilderness was destined to become the center of a civilization. As the smoke from the ram rose into the air, the physical and spiritual atmosphere of the journey reached its resolution. The knife was back in its sheath, the boy was free, and the sacrifice was complete. Abraham and Isaac stood together before the altar, no longer as priest and victim, but as two survivors of a divine encounter. The trauma of the last 3 days had been replaced by a clarity of purpose that could only be forged in such an extreme crucible. They had both looked into the abyss of the covenant's end and saw God standing on the other side. The mountain had served its purpose as a proving ground for the soul of the patriarch. But before they could descend back to the world of men, God had one final declaration to make regarding the future. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, but this message carried a weight different from the first intervention. This was not a command to stop, but a formal, legal ratification of a divine contract that would govern the rest of human history. God declared, "By myself I have sworn," an unprecedented phrasing because there is no higher authority for a deity to invoke than his own existence. The oath was granted specifically because Abraham had not withheld his son, proving that his loyalty was absolute and unbreakable. This moment transformed a personal trial into a permanent, irrevocable treaty between a creator and a bloodline. It confirmed that the test on the mountain was the final hurdle before the promise of a nation could move from a vision into a reality. Abraham stood by the smoldering altar, listening to words that guaranteed his name would never be forgotten. But the most shocking part of this declaration was that God was now legally bound by his own word to ensure Abraham's success. The promise that followed was expansive, using physical metaphors to describe a future that Abraham would never live to see in full. God promised to multiply Abraham's descendants until they were as numerous as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the seashore. This wasn't just a poetic description of a large family. It was a guarantee of survival and dominance in an ancient world where small tribes were constantly wiped out. God also added a military and political dimension, stating that Abraham's offspring would possess the gates of their enemies. In the Bronze Age, the gate was the seat of power and the strongest point of a city's defense, so this was a promise of total victory over any opposition. The blessing extended beyond the family line, claiming that through Abraham's offspring, every nation on earth would eventually be blessed. This turned Isaac's life into a global pivot point, making his survival necessary for the welfare of the entire human race. Abraham had walked up the mountain as a man with one son, but he was leaving it as the father of an unstoppable empire. The descent from Mount Moriah was a quiet, physical reversal of the 3-day climb, yet the two men who walked down were fundamentally different. Abraham and Isaac returned to the two servants who had been waiting with the donkey at the base of the hill. There is no record of what was said during this reunion, but the visual of the father and son walking back together was the only proof the servants needed that the worship was complete. The tension that had defined the upward journey was gone, replaced by a grim but satisfied peace. They began the long walk back toward the south, retracing the same steps they had taken in fear and secrecy just days before. Every landmark they passed was now a reminder of a crisis that had been averted through divine intervention. The physical burden of the wood was gone, and the fire had been spent on the ram. They were returning to the camp of Sarah, but they were carrying a secret that would redefine their family's identity forever. The group finally arrived back in Beersheba, the place where the journey had begun in the pre-dawn darkness. Abraham returned to his role as the patriarch of a large household, but his status in the eyes of God had been permanently elevated. He had moved past the stage of a mere follower and into the role of a proven partner who had passed the ultimate test of character. The story of what happened on Moriah likely became the central oral tradition of the family, passed down to ensure the next generations understood the cost of the covenant. Sarah saw her son return alive, perhaps never fully knowing how close she had come to losing him on that stone altar. Isaac grew into his own leadership, forever marked by the experience of being the living sacrifice who was ransomed by a ram. Abraham lived out his remaining years in the land of the promise, knowing that his legacy was secure, regardless of the challenges to come. His life would end in peace, but the mountain he left behind was already waiting for its next great sacrifice. The binding of Isaac stands as one of the most significant moments in the biblical timeline because it established the moral foundation of a nation. This event was never about God wanting a human life. It was a definitive rejection of child sacrifice, a practice that was common in the ancient world. On that summit, Abraham proved that his loyalty was absolute, but more importantly, he discovered that his God was a provider who would never demand the blood of his children. The mountain of Moriah would eventually become the heartbeat of a civilization, the very ground where future generations would come to seek mercy and remember the ram in the thicket. Abraham walked down that mountain as the father of a people, leaving behind a stone altar that would mark the site of the most sacred city on earth. The story of the binding ends here, leaving a legacy of faith that survived through the centuries.